After 3 failed attempts in the last 2 weeks, the Senate concludes legislative work on the much anticipated Electoral Act Amendment Bill 2026. The Senate passed the document rejecting Clause 60 and the provision for real-time electronic transmission of election results from each polling unit. The Senate, however, retained the provision of the Principal Act that favors manual vote counting and transfer of election results as prescribed by the Electoral Commission. But in a swift reaction, President of the Senate, Godswill Akpabio, said the Senate did not reject electronic transmission of results, saying that electronic transmission is part of what is retained in the Principal Act.
But the social media already is awash with the fact that the Senate has rejected electronic transmission. That is not true. That is not true. Electronic transmission had always been in our act. And what we did was to retain the electronic transmission, which had been in our act and which was used in 2022.
The Senate had earlier rejected the provision of Clause 18, which seeks to allow voters to replace missing voters' card by downloading them online. Senate also rejected the provision of the Electoral Act Amendment Bill that seeks to place 10-year ban on persons who buy and sell voters' cards. The lawmakers argued that the punishment is too punitive. It, however, accepted the fine of 5 million naira and 2 years jail term for offenders. A major high point was a heated debate about the provision that such amendment should be at least 360 days before election, and whether or not the amendment was not already an exercise of futility. While some lawmakers called for constitutional amendment to reduce the days to 180 days, others like Senator Nii Adegbomire argued that all that is required is to just amend the Principal Act. The Senate subsequently reduced the period to 180 days.
This is the constitutional which talks about time of the election. In other words, the date on which the election is to be held.
So,
Section 28 says, give notice when that election will be held. Two different things. Section 28 is not covered by the Constitution, so we can amend it if we want to.
On accreditation and voting, the lawmakers retained Clause 47 with minor adjustments by replacing smart card reader by Model Voter Accreditation System BVAS. Also, only the permanent voter's card can be used for identification at the polling unit.
They provided for smart card reader, which had been used in the previous election, and they said, or any other technological device that may be prescribed by the commission, which is BVAS. But at the time, they had not finalized maybe on the terminology or whatever.
So that
we are now correcting it to state BVAS.
On direct primaries, the Senate leaves it to political parties' constitution and guidelines. Akpabio denies any deliberate move by the Senate to delay the amendment of the Electoral Act, saying the Senate was only trying to do a thorough job.
let me just mention the fact that there was no deliberate attempt on the part of the Nigerian Senate to delay the amendment of the Electoral Act. Our intention had always been to ensure that we do our best and we do it painstakingly.
With this passage, what is left is the harmonization of the resolution of both chambers of the National Assembly and an onward transmission of the document to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu for his assent. Omo Bazwai, Arise News.
Well, thank you, Omo, for that report. And joining us to discuss the Senate's key amendments to the Electoral Act 2022 is Samson Itodo, Executive Director, Yaga Africa. Thank you so much for being here. And Happy New Year is the first time I'm seeing you.
Thank you very much. Happy New Year to you too.
So, I mean, we watched all of that after dilly-dallying, failed attempt twice. We finally have the Senate passing what it passed. But let's go to one of the most controversial amendments so far. The Senate is insisting it did not reject the real-time
the electronic
transmission of results to the INEC IRF portal. It says because it already exists in 2022. But what do you make of it? Because we know what is in the 2022 Electoral Act and what they're saying. From a democracy and civil rights perspective, where you sit, what has the Senate done by this act?
I think what the Senate has done by this act is to betray the trust of Nigerians. And not just betray the trust of Nigerians, is to make rubbish of all the gains that we've made. Because what happened today is a regression and a dangerous retreat to some of the lofty reforms that were introduced by the 2022 Electoral Act. The Senate President, I completely disagree with the Senate President. He's just being clever by half. Because what he is saying is that the ruling of the Supreme Court in the 2023 elections, they were very clear that electronic collation or transmission was unknown to the law, that INEC cannot, by virtue of its guidelines, introduce electronic transmission, and the IREV, it's clear. And so what the National Assembly did, particularly the two committees in the National Assembly, was to take that judicial pronouncement and update the law, because when the extant law says it shall be by a procedure determined by INEC, INEC went ahead in its guideline, determined the procedure, but the court now said, no, you have to insert it in the law. And the report before them, because I was part of the technical committee that was part of this entire process, what the House passed was that electronic transmission will be part of this process. In fact, the report also mentions the IREV. So I think that the Senate President is lying to Nigerians, because that's not what was provided in the report. It was clear, electronic transmission of result. But that's not also the only thing. One of the things that the Senate has also done is introduce some draconian provisions that will undermine the preparations for the 2023 election, especially logistics. What they have done, they've compressed the time frame. The reason why the 2022 Electoral Act provides that 360 days issue notice, campaign conduct of primaries, was to allow for logistics. What they have done now is to say that primaries will hold, about 90 days, and then INEC will publish the list of candidates 60 days to elections. For heaven's sake, when is INEC going to produce the ballot papers? And so we're going to run into a lot of logistical challenges, for the 2027 elections. If you look at one of the things the bill also does, and the place of the report, is that it makes it compulsory for presiding officers to compare results transmitted electronically and the ones collected manually. Yeah. What they have now done is to jettison that particular provision. So you cannot say that you did a thorough job. If this is the outcome of a thorough job, then I think that the Senate owes Nigerians a lot of apologies.
So, based on this development now, would you say that we should still go ahead with what seems to be like a waste of precious time, looking at so-called new or Electoral Act Amendment Bill 2020? Is it 25 now?
We're going to be 2026.
Yeah, it's going to be 2026. Should we even bother, or should we just rely on the 2022 Electoral Act, which seems to even be a better version of what the Senate has passed?
The 2022 Act, as it is,
as it is,
if what the Senate passed becomes adopted, because the legislative procedure is that both the House and the Senate, will have to constitute a conference committee and harmonize their position. The position of the House is in line with what the citizens have demanded.
Right.
So as they go into their conference, we need to put it on them that the House's provision is what aligns with the wills of Nigeria, because what the Senate did, it's antithetical, it's at variance with what Nigerians wanted. What they have only done is to prioritize their own primordial and perhaps personal interest over and above public interest. But the biggest worry for me is the Senate actually acting, independent, or there aren't any external forces, or they haven't read the body language of perhaps the powers that be, because some of the provisions they introduced were not the provisions in the report that the Senate Committee on INEC and the House Committee on INEC prepared, worked on painstakingly, but they introduced, other provisions. So it is really concerning. So even if they set up a conference committee, are they going to be serving us a fait accompli at the end of the day? This is why the House of Reps, which prides itself as the People House, this is the time to rise up and ensure that those provisions that they passed on December 19th is the one adopted by
but
the
even
committee.
the House of Reps, they've gone back to review what they passed.
No, but they didn't go back to review
They said they're going to take a look at it.
No, they
again,
said they were
unless-
going to take a look at it.
Yeah.
Especially some places. For instance, if you look at the provision around electronic transmission of results, what the law says is the presiding officer. That's what section 60 sub 3 says.
Right.
What they passed was they said decommission. And now they need to correct, there's some sort of inelegant drafting issues before they pass it. So their provision is what should hold sway.
Okay. When you say powers that be, I want to think that you're talking about Nigerians. When you said the Senate is not reading body language of powers that be.
No, clearly, if they were reading the body language of Nigeria,
then they will be doing the exact
then they wouldn't
opposite.
pass what they passed today
Right.
because it's a disgrace,
Okay,
honestly.
So let's look at some of the other things that they did
Yeah.
after this dilly-dallying. They replaced smart card readers with BVAS and also retaining PVCs as the sole voter identification. There's that. What do you make of that? And is it totally useless what the Senate has done?
Absolutely, because what was the proposal? The proposal was that in 2023, there were Nigerians whose names were on the voters' register, but they could not vote because they couldn't get their PVCs. Not because they didn't show up. They showed up, but because of logistic challenges on the part of INEC. In fact, some Nigerians went to the court to seek legal redress to enforce their voting rights. But INEC didn't produce their PVC, so they were disenfranchised. What INEC said, this proposal was INEC's proposal, and also citizens, was that we are now in a digital age. You can download the PVC online. That was INEC's proposal, also supported by civil society. In fact, they now said if you have the BVAS, and the BVAS has demonstrated that it can deepen the integrity of the process. If your name is on the voters register, if you show up with a NIMSI ID, with a national passport and your PVCs, that was what was contained in the report. What they have now passed is at variance with public interest. So there is no way we can say that this Senate is representative of the will and aspirations of Nigerians.
In the meantime, finally, Mupiton has said, look, he may be left with no choice than to go back and use the Electoral Act, 2022.
Yeah. In fact,
what are the implications of that very quickly?
Section 28 is very clear, 360 days. The current law in force is the 2022 Electoral Act. It is not an old act. Right. We wait to see when this process will be concluded. But if they don't conclude it in the next 2 weeks, the commission would have no choice but to issue the timetable. And that's what we told the commission today.
All right. Thank you very much, Samson Itodo, Executive Director, Yaga Africa.